Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the Monopoly video. So, Chapter 8, Monopoly. This is actually our last micro-econ chapter. After this, we make the pivot to macroeconomics. Last week, we were talking about perfect competition. The idea that if you can't make yourself special in a marketplace, if you sell the same thing as everyone else, and there's free entry, there's no profit in the long run. Well, now we're going to add market power. And market power can come from a few different places. First, let's say what market power is. It's the ability to set your own price. All right. That is a very powerful thing. We'll get to that. The technical videos are going to show what happens when now I can choose price and quantity. And it's going to mean that I can make a lot more money. Okay, we'll get to that. But let's talk about where the market power comes from. Market power comes from a few places. One, I might have some process or technique or cost advantage that no one else has. Right? I might just have better technology or some other way of organizing my workers better than they do. And so I might just have a cost advantage. That gives market power. Another thing that gives market power is if I have legal protections for my goods. Pharmaceutical companies do this all the time when they get patents for their new drugs. Movie studios get it when they copyright their movies. People will often get legal protections for their stuff, which means that they're the only one allowed to sell from it for a while. So that means as long as that patent or copyright or whatever is in place, I'm the only one who can sell this thing. Something else that can give market power is if you are the only person who owns a key input in a good. We'll come back to diamonds in a little bit, but there was one family who at one point owned 90% of the world's diamond supply, the De Beers family. Crazy, stupid rich, by the way. Anyway, market power. There are ways to get it. Oh yeah, another one is if you can just differentiate your product. If I can convince my customers that what I sell is special and no one else can match it, they'll pay extra for it. So any of that kind of stuff can give market power. So this sounds very different from the board behind me. The Monopoly game is not what we're talking about here, but it does share a common idea. I don't know if you've ever played this before, but you like go around the board, and if you land on places, you can buy them. And if you manage to own all of the places of a certain color, so here's 2 purple places, here's 2 blue places, there's green places over there and over there. Okay, if you manage to own all of the ones of a certain color, people have to pay you extra when they land on it. I forgot that part. If they land on a place you own, they owe you money. If they land on a place you own and you own all of that color, they owe you extra money. That's about as far as I'm going to go with the board game analogy. That captures Monopoly pretty well. You could have the same number of sales in a market, but if one company owns all of the supply, the price is going to be higher. Now, it's actually worse than that, though, because if one company owns all of the supply, what they'll probably do is restrict the output. Check the technical videos for that on details, but the gist of it is, if they limit the supply, they can create something like a quota or a price floor, whereby restricting the supply, they can jack the price up and increase producer surplus, which is parallel to profit. And so monopoly is actually going to be a form of market failure, where the market is not efficient. It does not maximize consumer and producer surplus. A market on its own that creates deadweight loss. Perfect competition doesn't do that. Equilibrium maximizes total surplus. Monopoly does. Because a monopoly maximizing profit will not maximize total surplus, it will create deadweight loss. Pivot, let's talk diamonds, folks. So the De Beers Company, as recently as like 35 years ago, owned 90% of all diamond production globally. That's a monopoly. I know a perfect monopoly would say 100%, but in real life, there's kind of no such thing as that in global markets. There's always someone on the fringes. Owning 90% of a large, expensive global market is crazy. They actually fought tooth and nail to keep that, by the way. Yeah, I'm not going to dig into it, but if you're curious, check out that Business Wars podcast again. There's several of them on the De Beers family. They did some pretty crazy stuff to maintain that kind of market power and to keep people out of their markets. They eventually had to give way. I think right now, I saw a graph that had them a few years ago, they owned like 40 something percent of the global market, which is still a ton, but it's not as much as it was. The world's gotten more competitive and we found more diamonds and stuff like that. Anyway, a lot of you are probably thinking, who are the De Beers? I've never heard of them. That's probably true. They don't actually sell you the diamond directly, right? Like you'll get yours from whatever jewelry store you go to, but they used to always have to buy it from the De Beers Company. Like they were like this supplier who owned almost the entire input of diamonds. And so that leads to some pretty interesting business stuff too. For instance, this diamond company, the De Beers Company, they started an ad campaign called "A Diamond Lasts Forever." Let me take this off. This is my wedding ring. Now, I don't have my wife's wedding ring with me right now, but women didn't always have diamonds in their wedding rings. We can actually thank clever marketing for that being tradition. That wasn't always a thing. But this company really, really, really pushed that you want your marriage to last as long as your diamonds and stuff like that. And they even had guidelines for how much money you make and what size of diamond you should buy for your significant other and all this stuff. Yeah, it's all from some very clever marketing. Now, what's cool about that from a business standpoint is they literally don't have to care where you buy it from. Like, they don't care if you go to Tiffany's or Walmart. If you're buying a diamond, it came from them because they owned all the diamonds. But it's just kind of interesting to think that like this like symbol that we're all like so like accustomed to, it was made by a company who owned all the diamonds. It was like, hey, how do we get people to like buy our diamonds? There was even one part in that Business Wars thing where they talked about how they had this big influx of amber colored diamonds that were considered like impure. They weren't like the clear white kind. And so they had a whole like ad marketing campaign and they called them like champagne diamonds and stuff that were like, they made it sound better. And so everyone starts buying them for extra money, even though like they used to be considered like inferior. It's pretty fascinating what you can do when you own a market. Anyway, since then, there have been lots of lawsuits and stuff and antitrust laws, so I should probably pivot to that. Because you see, in a lot of cases, monopolies get in trouble. There's something called antitrust law. They used to call monopolies trusts. I don't know why we changed, but whatever. And antitrust law was designed to bust them up. And it did it in a couple of ways. One thing is our antitrust laws can be used to prevent mergers of large companies. And you'll see this happen in real life every now and then. There will be like a big merger that's about to happen. Could be a couple of movie studios, could be a couple of cable companies, and they're like about to merge. And then the government gets involved and says, no, dog, you can't do that. It happens. Check it out. Another version of antitrust law is you can look at a company that's too big and is abusing its market power. One example, Microsoft is pretty much always being watched for this kind of behavior. They got some shrewd business stuff going on. And a while back, there was a big lawsuit for whether they had to, whether they were abusing their market power with all their Windows operating systems and using it to prevent other people from providing internet services or whatever. And there was like this big lawsuit about whether or not Internet Explorer should be broken off from Microsoft and become like its own separate company. Like stuff like that becomes issues. Currently today, there's debate on whether our big tech companies like Google, Apple, Amazon have become too large, and whether they should be split up into smaller little companies. That would all be under antitrust law. Whether or not it's going to happen, I have no idea. Okay, antitrust law is interesting because we don't enforce it very well. This is, I could get into some cynical reasons as to why that is. As your professor, I won't. But I don't know. Why would a large company be able to avoid the law? I'll let you try to think as to reasons as to why that might be. But in any case, antitrust law is not enforced consistently or clearly. But it is there. And if a company is abusing their market power flagrantly enough, they will face the United States government. One big example of this was the Rockefeller Foundation, or Rockefeller Corporation, I mean. Big oil company, Standard Oil Co. Standard Oil was a very large oil company. How big? Well, later, when they ended up breaking it up, they broke it into lots and lots of little companies. And some of these little companies were like Exxon and Mobil and other large oil companies today. But like the one company owned too much of the global oil market, so we broke them up. Why would we do that? Why would we break up a monopoly? Well, it goes back to the efficiency thing. What's a monopoly do? It's going to lower its quantity, raise its price to maximize profit. But when it does that, the whole market overall loses in terms of total surplus. It's inefficient for a monopolist to be a monopoly, usually. And so the government will often regulate them to try to make markets more competitive. Oh, you're too big? Let's break you into smaller fighting pieces. More competition. Yeah. And so that would be at the benefit of consumers at the expense of the businesses. Now, there is one kind of monopoly, though, last thought, that we often leave in place, and that's a natural monopoly. I mentioned that one of the sources of market power is having a cost advantage. Well, a natural monopoly is a version of that. If you're in a market with economies of scale, enough economies of scale that one big firm can serve the entire market with a lower average cost than if there were two or more firms. That economies of scale kicks in and makes them a monopoly, but it also means that there's a lower cost of production than if there were any number of smaller firms. This is common with local power companies and utility companies because they have massive fixed costs. If you have a power company, you have to generate electricity. You have to bring it through the power stations. You have to wire it all across the city, and you have to bring those wires to the people. And you have to do all of that citywide before anyone can turn the lights on. Well, I guess you don't have to do the whole city. You could wire a house at a time, but you get the idea. You need that whole infrastructure in place before someone can turn on their lights. That's a huge cost thing. And it's hard to imagine, like, hey, New Braunfels Utilities is like serving the whole city or whatever. And then a second company says, yeah, right, I'm going to enter this market. I'm going to build new power lines next to all your power lines. And I'm going to build a new wind farm next to your wind farm. and I'm going to like copy you and do it all over again. We're going to have twice as much infrastructure in this city. It doesn't work that way. So instead, the government doesn't try to force competition, but it will often price regulate. Texas energy is kind of weird because in a lot of places it's very unregulated, but through most of the country, your local power company doesn't have free reign to raise its prices. In most places, your local power company will have to like get approval from the city council or something before it can raise prices. That's not true in all areas of Texas. If you remember Snowmageddon a couple years back, there were stories of like people getting charged like $15,000, $20,000, $50,000 for their electric bills during Snowmageddon, which was only like a week long. And the companies were just like, hey man, it's supply and demand. The storm broke our supply and everyone wanted electricity, so we can charge what we want. Yeah, that's unrestrained market power right there. Whether or not they had to pay those bills was subject of lawsuits, and I didn't really follow it, but it was interesting. You should check that out. Anyway, I think that'll do for micro econ. What have we learned about? We learned about supply and demand, analyzing markets. We learned about cost functions and how firms behave if they are competitive versus if they have market power. And then we left a whole bunch of other stuff out. Now, if you take intermediate micro, some more topics I'll probably add. We'll probably add some consumer and producer theory, like how does a firm choose how much capital or labor? You know, how does automation work and all that? We'll probably learn a bit of the intermediate forms of competition. What happens when there's more than one company, but less than a ton? And what kind of strategy kicks in place there? We'll get into some game theory and other stuff. We'll probably get into some environmental topics, some information topics. It's pretty cool stuff. I like micro econ. But next week we pivot to macro and big picture items. And right now is exciting times for macroeconomic learning, even if it's kind of scary times for macroeconomics. So we'll see you next time. Good luck, guys. Peace out.